we got a couple questions to ask Mark Mix. First and foremost, Mark Mix is the president of the National Right to Work Committee, which is a 2.8 million member public policy organization. He also serves as president of the Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. Good morning, Mark. How are you?
Kim, I am doing well. The results in Virginia weren't good. The price of the Francis Scott Key Bridge is way too high, and we've got a problem at Johns Hopkins. So a lot going on today.
So much going on. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. I guess, you know what? let's start, of course, with the Hopkins charges. I came across this only because, of course, you and the work that you're doing. But then as I look deeper into it, I'm like, wow, this is a huge story, and a lot of people aren't really touching on it. Fill us in on what's going on, Mark.
Yeah, Kim, you know, it's almost like you can't make stories like this up. We have a client who is a Ph.D. candidate in molecular biophysics. And so I know Brian knows what that is, but I don't. So, you know, this is a problem because she is now under threat of discharge for her graduate studies because she will not give private financial information to the United Electrical Workers Union, who represents graduate students at Johns Hopkins. So they have now sent a letter to the Johns Hopkins administration saying that her graduate studies need to be terminated because she won't turn over private financial information to the union, who has no business asking for it. I mean, this is outrageous when you think about it.
No, that is outrageous. Mark, well, I guess my question is, how did we get here? Is this something that students usually turned over?
Yeah, what happened here is that during the Obama administration, the National Labor Relations Board, that is the 5-member board that adjudicates private sector labor policy in America, ruled that graduate students could be defined as employees for purposes of unionization. Prior to that, workers had, well, it goes back to the Clinton administration, then the Bush administration. It's almost like a tennis match, Kim. But basically, the union has exclusive bargaining privileges over graduate students at Johns Hopkins University and other universities across the country. This story has manifested itself, and we have clients at Cornell and Columbia and MIT and now at Johns Hopkins for workers and for students, literally students, PhD students, who are forced to be represented by the union in their graduate studies because they, quote, teach classes and do other things that PhD candidates have to do to fulfill their academic requirements. The fact that organized labor is involved in the higher education system, particularly in the private education system, is really problematic, and this is the result. You have someone who's studying to be a molecular microphysical biologist or whatever that was, and now her academic career is in jeopardy because the union demands say she must turn over private financial information to them as a condition of her employment and continued education.
Wow. Now here we just were, we were listening, Mark, just so you know where we were talking about a little bit last week. We're listening to President Trump as he was on with Laura Ingraham, and he was talking about the H-1B visas. And they were talking about the fact that we have a lot of talent coming in from overseas because they said we just don't have the talent here. And of course, there are many people saying, of course we have the talent here. Look at some of our Ivy League schools. Look at our schools in general. Now to hear this situation, I never knew that any of this existed. I had no idea that this was unionized in the first place.
Yeah, it is a surprise to people that kind of find out about it, particularly in situations like this. I mean, again, classifying graduate students, and now they're actually classifying undergraduate students. So, like, if you're a resident assistant in a dormitory, you now, under certain regulations, you can be unionized as a resident assistant, someone that's trying to help pay off their college bills or just being part of the residential life, at a college campus. It really is amazing. And interestingly enough, like, let's take the example of the United Auto Workers Union, UAW. Almost 35 to 40% of their membership now, Kim, are, quote, graduate students across the country, primarily in California, in the University of California system. So when you think of the United Auto Workers, assembling vehicles, don't think that anymore. Think about graduate students trying to get their PhDs and their master's degrees at private institutions across America.
This is insane. You're saying this is an Obama policy?
Yeah, the National Labor Relations Board ruled that these people could be classified as employees. And so if they're employees, then they're now covered by the National Labor Relations Act as far as private sector employees are concerned. And so now unions are organizing at higher education institutions across the country, and it's really a fertile field for them in many ways, unfortunately.
If you're just joining us, we're speaking to Mark Mix. He is the president of the National Right to Work Committee and also serves as the president of the Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. Mark, I know this student is a client of yours. I guess what's the next point of action here? I mean, these charges are filed, but I guess, what are you guys hoping is, number one, the outcome, and then also how soon can you get this moving along? I can imagine that she wants this done yesterday.
Yeah, indeed. A couple of things that are happening here. She has got a religious accommodation going back to 2024, which has protected her from a large part of the compulsory dues structure that the union imposes on these workers, or on these students in this case. And she also is using a Supreme Court case that we won, a case that came out of Maryland, actually, from a former Bell Atlantic employee by the name of Harry Beck, who was forced to pay dues and fees for political causes, which he objected to. He went to the U.S. Supreme Court. We represented him there, and he won some relief for private sector employees, protecting them against the ideological and political views of a union that gets control over their voice and their labor in the workplace because of labor policy that was written back in 1935. This case also has the added kind of condition that there is a federal law called the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, called FREPA for short, that protects college students from handing over private information to outside parties. So we're using the FREPA protections, we're using the Beck decision, and we're using the religious accommodations that we help students get across the country right now as the defense. But ultimately, this will be decided by a regional director for the National Labor Relations Board. We'll have to have a hearing. They'll hear the basically both sides. We think we can win the case. The hope is, Kim, to your point, that her education will not be interrupted during these proceedings, and will keep going to the point where ultimately we believe she'll win, and I think the union will back down. But one of the big parts of that, Kim, is making light of this so people know and shake their heads saying, how can this be?
Yeah. Yeah. No, Mark, as soon as I saw this, I was like, wait a minute, what? I mean, this is crazy. We have already, like I said before, we've got a shortage of kids even want to take, some of these kind of coursework on in the first place. Secondly, it's kind of like, well, here we're competing with other countries. We're trying to be the best of the best. And then we've got the best and the brightest now dealing with these issues in which you just stated. Mark, I also wanted to get your opinion here because, like I said, I saw your note on the right to work was kind of on the ballot there in Virginia when it came to Spanberger. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, well, when Abigail Spanberger was a member of Congress, she voted not once but twice to repeal all the right-to-work laws across the country. There are 26 states that have laws on the books that simply say this: you can choose whether or not to financially support a labor union, and it won't cost your job if you decide not to support their political agenda, their ideological agenda. So right-to-work laws protect your ability to choose how your money's spent, and then, how you basically labor with your labor against a private organization. Spanberger did not indicate on the campaign trail that she would outright repeal right to work, but we think it's a very dangerous situation because Winsome Sears said she supported right to work. Obviously, the results are in. Spanberger is going to be the governor of Virginia for the next 4 years, and we think that organized labor will immediately try to repeal right to work because it literally, Kim, means hundreds of millions of dollars in union dues that will be paid now as a condition of keeping your job in Virginia. We will become more like Maryland, unfortunately, for Virginians, and I don't mean to downcast on Maryland, but there are lots of issues up there that Virginia has been separate, and one of those issues is the economic development and the manufacturing job growth, the private sector job growth that comes with being a right-to-work state. It's part of a policy package that helps expand opportunities, and I think that's going to be a real battle as we move into January of next year.
Well, Mark, it's okay. You don't have to spare our feelings. We know that everybody looks at Maryland and says, you don't want to be Maryland. So so get your act together. Look, I was just in West Virginia, Mark, and they were saying the same thing. Like, the last thing we want to be is like Maryland. I guess, Mark Mix, first and foremost, thank you for joining me today. Moving forward, obviously we talked about what you want as far as the outcome in that case in Hopkins. Do you see anything on the horizon here in Maryland? I mean, Governor Westmore's, he leans pretty far left. I would think, it might even be more left than Abigail Spanberger. But have you seen anything concerning here in our state?
Well, yeah, I mean, the rebuild of the Francis Scott Key Bridge is whether it appears under a project labor agreement, which means union only. You know, Joe Biden, when he stood on the banks of the river looking at the bridge in the background, said this will be union made with American steel. I think we can get the American steel part right, but all of a sudden, Kim, as you mentioned in the lead up, and I've read the story this morning as well, that a $1.7 billion project is now turned into potentially a $5.2 billion project with 2 years more than was estimated in the reconstruction. Obviously, these are important jobs, but those union conditions, whether it be the prevailing wage issue that goes on it or the project labor agreement that says non-union contractors can't compete. And obviously, I think there's a single source contract on the construction, if I understand the whole thing going way back and thinking about it again. But the cost structure here is something that really is a problem. You know, we had this when we rebuilt the Wilson Bridge. It was Governor Glendening at the time that said it was going to be a project labor agreement. And because Maryland owns the river all the way up to the Virginia border, you had more control over it. But Governor Jim Gilmore in Virginia fought about that, and it brought the cost of that project down and brought it into the means where it was completed on time or close to being on time and under budget. So that's a big issue as you move forward.
Yeah, look, we're bracing for the worst here. Mark Mix with the Right to Work Foundation. Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
All right, Kim, thank you for the opportunity.
Yep, no, thank you. And, of course, we'll stay in touch with Mark and see what happens there at Hopkins. Did you guys know about that with the unions there? And I had no idea. I mean, it's almost like whatever obstacle they can come up with. And that's the thing about unions, you know, and it depends on where you're working, too, when you have, when you're in media. Luckily here at WCBM, we didn't have to, you know, join a union or anything like that. But at other stations, you are forced to join the union and to pay union dues. And I'm just like, dude, I don't want to be in this. I don't even want to be a part of this. But you're forced to do so. And so I can imagine what these students are thinking. Obviously, it costs them money, I'm sure, in some cases, just to reside, whether they're residing on campus or nearby or what have you. What a mess. What a mess. All right, we'll continue to follow that up with Mark Mix.